The disciplinary judge told me he'd already called the state prosecutor before my brother could finish his closing statement, and that single sentence made my mother collapse against the courtroom bench. My name is Dr. Morgan Hayes, and I'm sitting here in a Boston administrative courtroom watching my entire family realize they've just committed career suicide trying to destroy mine. The irony would be funny if my hands weren't shaking this hard. My older brother Colin, the golden child neurosurgeon, had just spent 40 minutes telling the medical board that I'd been practicing medicine illegally for 6 years. He presented documents, sworn statements, investigative reports. My parents sat behind him like they were attending my funeral, which I suppose they thought they were. My mother wore black. My father kept his surgeon's hands folded in his lap like he was praying. They reported me for fraud, said my medical license was fake, claimed I'd been running my community clinic in Roxbury on stolen credentials. Colin hired private investigators. My parents signed legal declarations. They brought everything they had to bury me. Judge Raymond Blackwell listened to all of it without changing expression. He's 70 years old, built his reputation on being unmovable. They call him the Granite because nothing shakes him. Then he opened my file. I watched his face do something I'd never seen in 2 decades of medicine. He went completely white, then flushed red, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. He gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. That's when he made the call to the prosecutor, right there, in the middle of the hearing. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed into something dangerous. This is going to be a long story, and I need you with me to hear how it ends. If you want to know what happened when my family's lies met the truth they never saw coming, stay close. You won't want to miss what comes next. I need to take you back 3 months to understand how we ended up here. The Hayes family isn't just any medical family in Boston. My father, Dr. Harrison Hayes, built the Hayes Medical Institute 40 years ago. It's the kind of private hospital where senators get their hip replacements and tech billionaires go for executive physicals. The waiting room has marble floors and original Monet paintings. A standard consultation costs more than most people's monthly rent. Colin followed my father's path perfectly. Harvard Med, prestigious residency, partnership in the family practice by 30. He drives a Tesla, lives in a brownstone in Beacon Hill, married a pharmaceutical heiress. He's everything my father wanted in a child. Then there's me. I also went to Harvard Med, also had top marks. But when I finished my residency 7 years ago, I told my father I wasn't joining the institute. I was opening a clinic in Roxbury to serve the community that raised me, the neighborhood where my grandmother lived before gentrification pushed her out. My father looked at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. He told me I was wasting my education. My mother cried and said I was throwing away my future. Colin just laughed and said I'd come crawling back within a year when I realized poor people don't pay enough to cover malpractice insurance. But I opened Sterling Health Collective anyway. Named it after my grandmother's maiden name, not Hayes. I hired 2 nurse practitioners, a bilingual medical assistant, and a part-time counselor. We operate on a sliding scale payment system. Some patients pay full price. Some pay what they can. Some pay in gratitude and homemade pupusas. The clinic thrived. Within 3 years, we were seeing 200 patients a month. We handled everything from diabetes management to prenatal care to immigration physicals. I worked 70-hour weeks and loved every exhausting minute. My family stopped inviting me to Christmas after year 2. The breaking point came 4 months ago at my father's 70th birthday party. It was held at the Institute, naturally. 200 guests in formal wear, champagne fountains, a string quartet. I showed up in the same dress I'd worn to 3 weddings because I'd just worked a 12-hour Saturday shift. Colin cornered me by the hors d'oeuvres table. He smelled like expensive scotch and entitlement. He told me the family was concerned about my lifestyle choices. He said they'd been hearing things about my clinic, about how I was accepting patients without proper verification, about how some of my success stories seemed too good to be true. I asked him what he meant by that. He smiled and said he was just looking out for me, that the family name meant something. that if I was cutting corners to compete with real medical facilities, it would reflect badly on all of us. I left the party early. That smile stayed with me for days. 2 weeks later, I got a call from one of my colleagues at Boston General. She said someone had been asking questions about me, about my credentials, about when I'd completed my residency. The person claimed to be doing background research for a medical award nomination. But something about the questions felt wrong. They were too specific, too focused on documentation rather than patient outcomes. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. The first real sign came when my landlord called. The building that houses my clinic had been contacted by someone claiming to be from the state health department. They wanted to verify my licensing information for their records. My landlord, bless him, told them to request it through official channels and hung up. But he wanted me to know. That's when I started paying attention. I pulled my own records from the state medical board. Everything was perfect. License current, no complaints, continuing education up to date. Whatever Colin was fishing for, he wasn't going to find it in the official database. But I knew my brother. He doesn't give up when he wants something. And what he wanted was to prove I didn't belong in medicine. The thing about Colin is that he genuinely believes he's superior. Not just to me, but to everyone who doesn't move in his circle. He sees medicine as a profession for the elite, something that should remain exclusive and expensive. The idea that I was succeeding while serving people he considered beneath notice offended him on a fundamental level. I started documenting everything. Every patient interaction, every billing statement, every continuing education course. I backed up all my files to 3 separate locations. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it would be something. The formal complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning in September. It came via certified mail, which meant I had to sign for the weapon they were using to try to destroy me. The medical board was investigating allegations that I'd obtained my license through fraudulent means. The complaint was 40 pages long. It included sworn statements from my parents confirming they'd witnessed me fail my board exams. It included a letter allegedly from the testing center stating I'd never passed. It included financial records supposedly showing I'd paid someone to create fake credentials. Every single page was signed by Colin as the primary complainant. I sat in my tiny office, the one with the broken air conditioning and the second-hand desk, reading through my brother's meticulously constructed lie. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't about medicine. This was about the fact that my clinic was succeeding wildly, while his expensive concierge practice had lost 3 major clients last quarter. This was about me being happy while doing something he'd promised our father I would fail at. This was about him needing me to lose so he could keep feeling like he'd won. I hired my own investigator 3 days after receiving the complaint. Not the kind my brother used, the ones who lurk outside divorce lawyer offices. I hired Marcus Chen, a former FBI forensic accountant who now works private cases in Boston. Marcus is 60, looks like someone's harmless uncle, and has a mind that can dismantle financial fraud like a surgeon removing a tumor. I'd met him 2 years earlier when he brought his daughter to my clinic for an emergency appendicitis diagnosis. He told me then that if I ever needed anything, he owed me. I was calling in that debt. I gave Marcus everything. The complaint documents, my legitimate records, my family's financial information that I could access through shared accounts my mother insisted we all maintain for estate planning. I told him to find whatever Colin had manufactured and show me how he'd done it. What Marcus found in 3 weeks would have taken me 3 years. The failure letter was the masterpiece of the fraud. It looked perfect. Official letterhead from the Massachusetts Medical Licensing Board, dated 6 years ago, stating I'd failed my final examination and would need to retest. The signature belonged to Dr. Patricia Morrison, who'd been the board administrator at the time. Except Patricia Morrison retired in 2010. In 2012, when I actually took my boards, the administrator was someone else entirely. Marcus pulled the real records. Not only had I passed, I'd scored in the top 5% nationally. But here's where it got interesting. The fake letter used a font that didn't exist until 3 years ago. Microsoft developed it for Windows 10. The original documents from 2012 used a completely different typeface. Colin had created his smoking gun on his home computer using current software, then artificially aged the paper. Marcus found the receipt. Colin had purchased specialty paper and aging chemicals from a theatrical supply company in Cambridge. He'd also bought a vintage typewriter on eBay to create the registration marks that made the document look like it had been processed through old office equipment. My brother had spent $3,000 fabricating evidence. But the real revelation came when Marcus traced the private investigators Colin hired. They weren't investigators. They were a media consulting firm that specializes in opposition research for political campaigns. The kind of people who dig up dirt on candidates, or create it when necessary. Marcus found their contract. Colin paid them $45,000 not to investigate my credentials, but to create a narrative that would discredit me. The contract explicitly mentioned creating documentary evidence if existing evidence proved insufficient. In other words, my brother paid professionals to frame me. I sat in my apartment reading through Marcus's report at 2 a.m, and something inside me shifted. This wasn't a family disagreement anymore. This was premeditated destruction. Colin hadn't just reported concerns about my practice. He'd constructed an elaborate lie designed to end my career, destroy my reputation, and potentially land me in prison for fraud. The question was why? Why invest that much money and effort? My clinic wasn't competing with his practice. We served completely different populations. I wasn't taking his patients or his prestige. That's when Marcus showed me the second part of his investigation. The Hayes Medical Institute was in trouble. Serious trouble. 3 major investors had pulled out over the past 18 months. My father had taken out substantial loans using the family trust as collateral. Colin's personal finances showed he'd borrowed against his own house twice in the last year. The institute was bleeding money, and they needed a scapegoat. More specifically, they needed a reason to access the family trust without my consent. See, my grandmother left her estate in equal shares to me and Colin, but it was structured so that any disbursement required unanimous agreement. If I was convicted of fraud, I'd lose my share. The trust would revert entirely to Colin, who could then use it to save the institute. My brother wasn't just trying to destroy my career. He was trying to rob me to save his. Marcus found one more thing. He traced some unusual payments from my mother's personal account. Small amounts, $500 here, $1,000 there, always in cash withdrawals. They started 6 months ago and continued monthly. He followed those withdrawals to a private investigator, a real one this time, who specialized in medical malpractice cases. My mother had hired him to find actual complaints against my practice, real mistakes I'd made that they could use. He'd found nothing. My record was spotless. Every patient survey came back positive. Every outcome was documented and appropriate. In 6 months of digging, he couldn't find a single legitimate complaint. That's why they had to manufacture one. I spent the rest of that night thinking about my mother signing those false declarations. My father adding his physician's seal to documents swearing I was a fraud. Colin orchestrating it all with the cold precision of someone planning a surgical procedure. They'd sat around a table somewhere, probably the Institute's conference room with its mahogany furniture and oil paintings, and decided to destroy me. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because they needed my money and couldn't stand my success. The hearing was scheduled for 2 months out. I had 60 days to prepare my defense. Marcus asked me if I wanted to file a countersuit, go on the offensive, expose them before they could expose me. I told him no. I told him I wanted to walk into that hearing and watch them present every piece of fabricated evidence while I held the truth in my briefcase like a loaded weapon. I wanted to see their faces when they realized they'd underestimated me one final time. Marcus smiled when I said that. He told me he'd have everything documented, cross-referenced, and ready to present. He said we weren't just going to win this. We were going to end it so completely that they'd never come after me again. I went back to work the next day. I saw patients, wrote prescriptions, held the hand of a terrified teenager getting her first pelvic exam. I did my job the same way I'd been doing it for 6 years, with competence and compassion, and every night, I built the case that would save me and destroy them. The hardest part of the next 6 weeks was pretending I didn't know. My mother called 2 weeks before the hearing. She used her concerned voice, the one she reserves for charity galas and distant relatives. She wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, mother and daughter. She suggested a restaurant in the South End, expensive but not ostentatious. I met her there on a Wednesday afternoon. She wore pearls and a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than I pay my medical assistant in a month. She'd already ordered wine when I arrived. The first 15 minutes were small talk. She asked about the clinic with the careful tone of someone discussing a terminal illness. She mentioned Colin's latest publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. She wondered if I'd considered taking some time off, maybe traveling, getting some perspective. Then she got to the point. She told me the medical board investigation was probably just routine, but these things could get messy. She said the family wanted to help. My father had connections on the board, people who owed him favors. They could make this go away quietly if I was willing to be reasonable. Reasonable meant closing my clinic. Reasonable meant joining the institute, where they could supervise my work properly. Reasonable meant admitting I'd been in over my head and accepting their guidance. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said she knew I'd made mistakes. Everyone does. But family protects family. She said they just wanted to help me before things got worse. I looked at my mother's manicured hand on top of mine and realized she genuinely believed her own lie. She'd convinced herself that I was guilty, that she was doing me a favor, that this intervention was an act of love. I told her I appreciated her concern. I said I'd think about her offer. I watched relief flood her face. She paid for lunch and hugged me goodbye in the parking lot. She smelled like Chanel No. 5 in Delusion. I went straight to Marcus's office and told him about every word. He recorded my statement and added it to our file. He said my mother had just provided us with evidence of attempted coercion. 2 days later, my father called. This was unusual. My father and I haven't had a real conversation in 4 years. He communicates through my mother or not at all. He wanted to meet at the institute, his office, after hours. He said there were things we needed to discuss face to face. I went. I walked through those marble halls, past the artwork and the hushed efficiency, and took the elevator to the top floor where the founding physicians keep their offices. My father's door still had his name in gold lettering. He sat behind his desk like a king on a throne. He didn't stand when I entered. He gestured to the chair across from him, the one positioned slightly lower than his. A subtle power play he'd used my entire life. He told me he'd spent 40 years building his reputation. He said the Hayes name meant something in Boston medical circles. He spoke about legacy and responsibility and the weight of family expectations. Then he told me what he really wanted. The institute needed capital. They had an opportunity to acquire a smaller hospital network, expand their reach, solidify their position. But the family trust was locked up in that ridiculous structure my grandmother had created, and I was being stubborn about not allowing disbursement. He said if the medical board hearing went badly for me, which he feared it would given the evidence they'd uncovered, it would be better if I'd already voluntarily relinquished my share of the trust. Cleaner, less messy legally. It would show good faith that might help me avoid criminal charges. He pushed a document across his desk. A trust amendment, already drafted, already notarized. It just needed my signature. I picked up the paper and read it carefully. The language was clever. It didn't explicitly say I was giving up my inheritance. It restructured the trust so that Colin had sole authority over disbursement decisions. I'd still technically own my share, but I'd have no control over it. I looked up at my father and asked him if he really believed I'd failed my medical boards. If he honestly thought I'd been practicing illegally for 6 years. He didn't answer directly. He said belief wasn't the point. Evidence was the point, and the evidence was what it was. I set the document back on his desk, unsigned. I I told him I'd see him at the hearing. He said that was unfortunate. He said he'd tried to help me, but I'd always been stubborn. He said he hoped I wouldn't regret my decision. I left his office and threw up in the Institute's marble bathroom, not from fear, from rage so pure it made me physically sick. But here's what my father didn't know. The office where we met had been renovated 2 months earlier. New everything, including a modern security system with cameras and audio recording in every room. The Institute installed it after a theft in the pharmacy. Marcus had a contact in the security company. That contact had provided us with access codes to the system as a favor for a favor. We'd been recording every conversation in that office for 3 weeks, waiting to see if anyone in my family would slip up. My father had just confessed to attempted financial coercion on camera, in his own office, in 4K resolution with perfect audio. Marcus called it the insurance policy. If they wanted to play dirty, we had ammunition. I spent the remaining weeks before the hearing going through the motions of normal life. I saw patients. I paid bills. I called my grandmother's grave at the cemetery and told her I was fighting for everything she'd taught me about standing up to bullies. My family thought they'd backed me into a corner. They thought desperation would make me compliant. They forgot that I'd spent 6 years running a clinic in an underfunded neighborhood where every day was a fight against systems designed to fail my patients. I'd learned how to be resourceful. I'd learned how to find solutions when there were no good options. I'd learned how to win. The week before the hearing, I got a visitor at the clinic I never expected to see. Dr. Patricia Morrison walked into my office on a Thursday afternoon without an appointment. She was 78 years old, officially retired for 15 years, and supposedly the person who'd signed my fake failure letter. She sat down across from my desk and pulled out a folder. She told me she'd received a very interesting phone call 3 months ago from someone claiming to be Colin Hayes, asking detailed questions about medical licensing procedures from 2012. Specifically, he wanted to know about record retention policies, signature formats, and whether old documents were stored digitally or in physical archives. Patricia had run the Massachusetts Medical Licensing Board for 30 years. She'd seen every type of fraud attempted. Her instinct told her something wasn't right about that call, so she'd done what she always did when something smelled wrong. She started investigating. She found my actual file from 2012. Perfect scores, exemplary evaluations, glowing recommendations. Then she started hearing whispers through her network about a complaint being filed against me. A complaint that cited documents bearing her signature from a time when she hadn't worked for the board in years. She'd brought copies of everything. Real documents with her real signature, time-stamped digital records, proof of her retirement date, a forensic comparison between her actual signature and the forged one on Colin's letter. The differences were subtle but clear. The forged signature had slightly different pressure points. The ink was wrong for the pens the board used in 2012. Most damning, the paper stock wasn't available until 2019. Patricia told me she'd already contacted the medical board about the forgery. She'd submitted an official statement that the documents in my complaint file were fraudulent. She'd offered to testify at my hearing, but that wasn't why she was here. She told me she'd done more digging into Colin, into my father, into the Hayes Medical Institute, and she'd found something that changed everything. 4 years ago, the Institute had a malpractice case that was quietly settled and sealed. A patient died during a routine surgery. The attending surgeon was Colin Hayes. The investigation found he'd been impaired during the procedure, prescription medication mixed with alcohol. The family was paid $3 million to sign an NDA, and the matter was buried. My father used Institute funds to pay the settlement, funds that legally belonged to the non-profit charitable trust that operates the hospital. That's embezzlement. The board of directors was never informed. Patricia had copies of the settlement agreement. She'd obtained them through a contact whose daughter had been a paralegal at the law firm that handled the case. Everything was documented: bank transfers, falsified budget reports, cover-up communications. She'd been sitting on this information for 2 years, waiting to see if anyone in my family would do something that justified exposing it. My complaint had triggered her decision. She told me Colin wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance. He was trying to discredit me before I could discover the malpractice case and the embezzlement. If I lost my medical license, anything I said about his misconduct would be dismissed as the bitter accusations of a disgraced physician. I asked her why she was helping me. We'd never met. She had nothing to gain from this fight. She leaned back in her chair and told me about her granddaughter, Elena Morrison, 26 years old, type 1 diabetic. Elena had come to my clinic 18 months ago when she lost her insurance and couldn't afford her insulin. I'd put her on our sliding scale program, helped her navigate patient assistance programs, kept her supplied until she got back on her feet. Elena was Patricia Morrison's only grandchild. I'd kept her alive during the 3 months she was between jobs. Patricia told me she believed in paying debts. She told me the Hayes family represented everything wrong with modern medicine, gatekeeping and greed disguised as excellence. She said watching me go down would make her complicit in their corruption, so she was going to war. She'd already filed formal complaints against Colin with 3 different medical boards. She'd sent the malpractice documents to the state attorney general's office with a detailed timeline of the embezzlement. She'd contacted the IRS about the institute's nonprofit status and the misappropriation of charitable funds. By the time the disciplinary hearing happened, there would be 5 separate investigations running into various Hayes family enterprises. But here's the part that made my hands shake when she told me. Patricia had also discovered that I wasn't the first person my family had tried to destroy. 8 years ago, my father had a junior partner at the institute, Dr. James Chen. James had discovered some questionable billing practices and raised concerns to the board. Within 6 months, James was facing malpractice claims, investigations into his credentials, and a whisper campaign that destroyed his reputation. James now works at a free clinic in Providence, basically the same work I do, but he'd lost everything to get there. Patricia had tracked him down. She'd told him what was happening to me. James had agreed to testify if needed. He had documentation from his own case that showed a pattern of behavior. The Hayes family had a history of destroying anyone who threatened their empire. Patricia stood up to leave. She told me she'd see me at the hearing. She said I should prepare myself, because this was going to get ugly before it got better. The Hayes family doesn't lose gracefully. I watched her walk out of my clinic, this retired administrator who'd become my unexpected avenging angel, and I finally understood the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just about clearing my name. This was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had been going on for decades. My family had built their success by crushing anyone who stood in their way, by manipulating systems, by using their power to silence dissent. I'd thought I was fighting to save my career. I was actually fighting to end their reign. 3 days before the hearing, I received a package at my apartment. No return address, just my name in neat block letters. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The note said, "Your father ruined my career 20 years ago. I'm returning the favor." The signature was Dr. Eleanor Grant. I'd heard the name before in family stories, always spoken with contempt. Eleanor Grant had been my father's partner when he first started the institute. She'd provided half the startup capital, half the initial patient base, half the medical expertise. According to family legend, she'd left because she couldn't handle the pressure of building a practice. The flash drive told a different story. Eleanor had kept everything. Financial records showing my father had systematically bought out her ownership stake for pennies on the dollar by fabricating debt and losses. Communications where he'd threatened to report her for Medicare fraud if she didn't accept his buyout terms. Evidence that the fraud claims were entirely manufactured. She'd left not because she was weak, but because fighting him would have destroyed her, and she had 2 small children to support. She'd taken the settlement, signed the NDA, and spent the next 20 years building a successful practice in Vermont. But NDAs expire. Hers had expired 6 months ago. The flash drive also contained something else, a list of names, doctors, nurses, administrators, 15 people over 20 years who'd worked at the Hayes Medical Institute and left under suspicious circumstances. Each one had been threatened, coerced, or professionally destroyed when they became inconvenient. Eleanor had been tracking them. She'd been waiting for the right moment to act. My case was that moment. She'd already contacted 12 of the 15. 10 had agreed to provide statements. Some had evidence of financial manipulation. Others had proof of medical records being altered to hide mistakes. One had recordings of my father threatening to destroy her custody arrangement if she reported safety violations. It was a pattern of institutional corruption spanning 2 decades. I called Marcus immediately. He came to my apartment, reviewed everything on the flash drive, and let out a low whistle. He told me this changed the entire scope of the hearing. This wasn't about my license anymore. This was about dismantling a criminal enterprise. We spent the next 2 days coordinating with Eleanor and the other witnesses. We created a timeline of abuse. We cross-referenced financial records with personnel files. We built a case so airtight that even my family's expensive lawyers wouldn't find a gap. But I still needed one more piece. I needed to understand the internal dynamics, the pressure points, the cracks in their alliance. That's when my mother made her second mistake. She called me the night before the hearing. She was crying, which was unusual. My mother doesn't cry unless there's an audience. She told me Colin was scaring her. He'd been acting erratic, aggressive. He'd yelled at my father during a meeting at the institute. He'd thrown a crystal tumbler across the office. She said Colin kept saying he'd ruined everything, that the plan was falling apart, that they should never have listened to him. She said my father had told Colin to pull himself together, that it was too late to back out now. She wanted me to know she was sorry. She said she'd just been trying to protect the family. She asked if there was any way to stop what was about to happen. I told her I'd see her in court. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment and processed what she'd revealed. Colin was falling apart. The pressure was cracking him. He knew something was wrong, but couldn't identify what. The confidence he'd shown when filing the complaint was gone, replaced by paranoia and fear. My father was still trying to maintain control, but his authority over Colin was slipping. Their alliance was fracturing under the weight of their lies. Marcus had told me that guilty people always make mistakes when the pressure builds. They turn on each other. They start protecting themselves instead of maintaining a unified front. I just had to wait for that moment and exploit it. I spent my last night before the hearing reviewing everything one final time. Every document, every piece of evidence, every statement from every witness. I knew this case better than I knew my own medical school textbooks. Around midnight, I allowed myself to think about what came after. If we won, if everything went according to plan, the Hayes Medical Institute would be finished. My father's reputation would be destroyed. Colin would likely lose his license and face criminal charges. My mother would be left with nothing but the wreckage of the empire she'd helped build. Part of me felt sick about it. They were still my family. I still remembered my father teaching me to ride a bike, my mother braiding my hair before school, Colin letting me wear his stethoscope when I was 8. But those people were gone, if they ever really existed. The people who would appear in court tomorrow had tried to destroy me to cover their crimes. They'd manufactured evidence, committed fraud, and attempted to steal my inheritance. They'd made their choice. Now they'd live with the consequences. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I laid out my clothes for court, the same professional suit I'd worn to hundreds of patient consultations. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a working physician who'd spent 6 years serving her community. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. He said everything was in place. Patricia Morrison would be there. Eleanor Grant would be there. The other witnesses were confirmed. The evidence was cataloged and ready to present. He added one more line. Your family has no idea what's about to hit them. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep. Tomorrow, the truth would finally speak. The courtroom smelled like lemon disinfectant and old wood when I arrived at 8 a.m. Judge Raymond Blackwell was already at his bench, reviewing preliminary materials. My family sat on the opposite side of the aisle, Colin in his $3,000 suit, my parents dressed like they were attending a state funeral. Marcus sat beside me with 3 banker's boxes of evidence. Behind us, Patricia Morrison occupied the first row of the gallery. Eleanor Grant sat 2 rows back. I didn't look at them directly, but I felt their presence like armor. Colin presented first, just as we'd anticipated. He approached the bench with manufactured confidence, carrying the red folder that contained all his fabricated evidence. He began his statement about how concerned he'd been about irregularities in my practice, how he'd felt duty-bound to investigate, how shocked he'd been to discover the depth of my deception. Judge Blackwell listened without expression. He's famous for that granite face, the complete absence of readable emotion. Colin must have found it encouraging because he kept talking, embellishing his lies with medical terminology and false concern. Then Colin handed over his evidence. The fake failure letter, the sworn statements from my parents, the investigation report from the consulting firm he'd paid $45,000. Blackwell opened the red folder. He examined the failure letter first, holding it up to the light, running his finger along the edge of the paper. He read it slowly, completely silent. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. That's when I saw it happen. The judge's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a tightening around his eyes, a slight pallor in his complexion. He looked at the document like it had transformed into something venomous. He set it down carefully and picked up the phone on his bench. He made a call right there, in the middle of the hearing. He asked for the state records director by name. He read her a document number from the fake letter. He listened to her response. Then he hung up and looked directly at Colin with an expression that would have stopped a charging bull. He asked Colin to confirm under oath that he'd verified this document's authenticity. Colin said yes, absolutely. His investigators had confirmed everything. The judge asked if Colin understood that perjury in a medical board hearing carried criminal penalties. Colin said he did, and he stood by his evidence completely. That's when Blackwell called Patricia Morrison to the stand. Patricia walked up calmly, was sworn in, and proceeded to systematically destroy every piece of Colin's case. She testified that the failure letter was a forgery. She explained the signature discrepancies, the font anachronisms, the paper stock impossibilities. She presented my actual records showing perfect scores. I watched Colin's face lose color. He turned to his lawyer, whispering frantically. The lawyer looked increasingly panicked, shuffling through documents. Then Blackwell called Marcus as an expert witness. Marcus presented the evidence trail, the theatrical supply purchase, the consulting firm contract explicitly mentioning creation of documentary evidence, the bank transfers showing Colin's payments for manufactured proof. My father stood up and tried to speak. Blackwell told him to sit down or be removed from the courtroom. My father sat. Then came Eleanor Grant. She walked to the stand with 20 years of suppressed rage in her eyes. She testified about the Institute's founding, about my father's systematic theft of her ownership stake, about the threats and coercion. She presented financial documents that made my father look like a common criminal. But here's what I hadn't expected. Eleanor didn't just have evidence about the past. She'd been investigating the Institute's current finances, too. She'd discovered that the hospital was deeper in debt than even Marcus had found. They'd been cooking the books for 5 years, showing profits while hemorrhaging money. The Institute was basically bankrupt. My trust fund inheritance wasn't just convenient, it was essential. Without it, the entire operation would collapse within 6 months. Judge Blackwell looked at my father and asked if he had anything to say. My father stayed silent. For the first time in my life, I saw him understand that his power had limits. Then Blackwell did something unprecedented. He called a 30-minute recess and disappeared into his chambers with his clerk. When he returned, he had the district attorney on a conference line. He stated for the record that he was dismissing all charges against me with a formal apology from the medical board. He announced that he was referring the matter to criminal prosecution for fraud, perjury, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit medical board fraud. 2 court officers approached Colin. He started backing away, saying there had been a misunderstanding, that he could explain everything. They read him his rights, while my mother sobbed into my father's shoulder. But Blackwell wasn't finished. He asked the DA if there were grounds to hold my father as a co-conspirator. The DA said yes. Based on the evidence presented, there were substantial grounds. My father was arrested in open court. The man who'd spent 40 years building his reputation was handcuffed and led out through the same doors where he'd entered that morning expecting to watch me destroyed. My mother tried to approach me. She was crying, reaching out, saying she didn't know it would go this far. I stepped back. I told her she'd signed legal documents swearing I was a fraud. She'd chosen her side. The hearing ended at 2 p.m. What was supposed to be my professional execution had turned into my family's complete destruction. The news crews outside were already broadcasting the story. By evening, every medical publication in Boston would be running headlines about the Hayes Medical Institute scandal. Marcus packed up our evidence boxes. Patricia hugged me and said she'd see me around. Eleanor shook my hand and told me I'd done well. She said my grandmother would have been proud. I walked out of that courthouse into the October afternoon. The air felt different, lighter, like I'd been breathing through a filter for years and someone had finally removed it. My phone started buzzing immediately. Messages from colleagues, from patients, from people I hadn't spoken to in years. The story was everywhere. But I didn't read them. I had somewhere else to be. The Hayes Medical Institute closed its doors permanently 3 weeks after the hearing. The state medical board investigation uncovered 5 years of systematic fraud. My father had been embezzling charitable trust funds, falsifying financial reports, and covering up medical errors for over a decade. Colin had 7 malpractice complaints that had been buried through payoffs and threats. The whole operation was rotten from the foundation up. My father took a plea deal. 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. He'll be 75 when he gets out if he makes it that long. His medical license was permanently revoked. The man who'd built his entire identity around being a physician will spend the rest of his life as inmate 847392. Colin got 10 years. The prosecution went harder on him because of the degree of premeditation in my case. Creating false evidence, attempting to destroy my career while covering his own malpractice history, the conspiracy elements. His lawyer tried to argue mental health issues. The judge wasn't sympathetic. My mother wasn't charged criminally, but she lost everything anyway. The Institute's assets were seized to pay victims of my father's fraud. The house, the investment accounts, the country club membership. She's living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Quincy now, working part-time at a medical supply company. She calls occasionally. I don't answer. The trust fund that sparked this whole nightmare was restructured. 50% went to a victims' compensation fund for everyone harmed by the Institute's fraud. The other 50% was placed under independent management. I finally have access to my grandmother's money, though I barely touch it, because the Sterling Health Collective is thriving without it. The publicity from the trial brought attention to our work. We received grants from 3 major foundations. The city provided us with a larger facility. I was able to hire 2 more physicians, expand our hours, add mental health services and dental care. We're now seeing 800 patients a month. We've become a model for community healthcare in Boston. Harvard Medical School sends students to do rotations with us. The same institution that trained me to serve the elite is now learning from what we built, serving everyone else. Dr. James Chen joined our practice 6 months ago. The physician my father destroyed 8 years ago found his way back to medicine through the same community clinic model I'd created. He says working here reminds him why he became a doctor in the first place. Patricia Morrison serves on our advisory board. Eleanor Grant funded a new wing dedicated to women's health. The people my family tried to crush became the foundation of something better than anything the Hayes Institute ever represented. I still think about them sometimes. My father in his cell, probably still believing he was the victim of circumstances. Colin in therapy, maybe finally confronting what drove him to destroy his own sister. My mother alone in that apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. I don't hate them. That feeling burned out somewhere during the trial. What I feel now is something closer to grief for what could have been if they'd chosen differently. But I can't carry that grief and do my work. My patients need me present, not haunted by family ghosts. So I put that sadness in a box, acknowledge it exists, and focus on the life I'm building. Last month I treated a woman named Sophie Chen. She'd been avoiding doctors for 3 years because she couldn't afford her copays. She came to us with what she thought was a persistent cough. Turned out to be early-stage lung cancer, caught just in time to be treatable. She cried in my office when I explained her prognosis was good. She told me she'd been preparing to die. She'd written letters to her kids. She'd been saying goodbye in small ways every day. Now she's finishing chemotherapy and planning her daughter's wedding. That's what I'm fighting for. Not revenge against my family. Not vindication. Just the chance to save lives that the current system considers expendable. The judge who presided over my hearing retired last year. Before he left the bench, he wrote a letter to the medical board commending my work. He said in 30 years of medical oversight, he'd never seen a physician more dedicated to the fundamental oath of doing no harm. That letter is framed in my office, right next to my medical degree. The one Colin tried to claim was fake, the one my family attempted to destroy me for earning. Some days I walk past that degree and remember being 26 years old, taking the Hippocratic Oath for the first time. I remember believing that medicine was about healing, that family meant loyalty, that doing good work would be enough. I was naive about a lot of things, but I wasn't wrong about the healing part. This work, this life I've built in Roxbury, serving people who've been failed by systems like the one my father created, this is what medicine is supposed to be. Not marble floors and original Monets, not executive physicals for senators, just competent, compassionate care for anyone who walks through our door. My grandmother would have loved this place. She would have sat in our waiting room swapping recipes with patients, complaining about her arthritis, making everyone laugh. She left me that trust fund hoping I'd do something meaningful with it. I think I finally have. If you're listening to this from somewhere out there, I hope you'll remember that your family doesn't define you. Your past doesn't limit you. The people who try to destroy you don't get the final word on your story. You do. Tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know this story reached you, wherever you are. And if you want to hear more stories about people who fought back and won, about truth prevailing over power, about building something better from the ruins of betrayal, stay close. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because there are more stories to tell, and I'm just getting started.